I went out to camp because I wanted quiet. I wanted trees, cold air, the sound of wind moving through branches instead of cars and people. I picked a place that was not far from a small forest road, but still far enough that I could not see it from where I planned to set my tent. I checked the weather, packed food, water, a small stove, a headlamp, and the usual camping gear. Everything felt normal. Nothing felt strange or heavy. It was just a regular plan for a regular night in the woods. The hike-in was calm. My backpack felt heavy at first, then my body settled into its own rhythm. The path was not marked, just a thin line of dirt where others had walked before. The ground was soft and dry pine needles crushed under my boots. I could smell sap and damp soil every time I stopped. There were birds somewhere above me, out of sight, and the distant creak of trees that rubbed against each other when the wind pushed them. I remember thinking that the forest looked almost gentle in the afternoon light, like nothing bad could exist in it. I set my tent near a small clearing, not perfectly flat but close enough. There was a fallen log that made a good place to sit. I gathered wood and made a small fire ring out of stones. I took my time with everything, moving slow and calm, enjoying the feeling of being away. When the tent was finally standing and the firewood stacked, I felt proud in a simple, quiet way. My body was tired in a clean, honest way. The sun went down faster than I expected. The trees blocked most of the horizon, so one moment there was light and the next there was heavy shade. The forest changed with it. The colors faded into dark shapes. Every sound seemed louder. I cooked my meal on the stove, ate and cleaned up. I was careful with my food, sealing everything, making sure no smells would draw animals in. I had read enough about that. I did everything right, or at least I thought I did. The first strange feeling came when I realized how still I had become. I was just sitting on the log, watching the last of the light drain out of the sky, and I felt something like pressure on the back of my neck. Not a touch, just that tight feeling you get when you know someone is standing behind you even if you have not turned around yet. I looked around slowly. Trees, shadow, my tent, my pack leaning against it. Everything was exactly where it should be. There was nothing to see. The forest was quiet, but forests are often quiet, so I told myself it was nothing more than my brain finally noticing the silence. Night settled completely and the fire died down into faint orange coals. I did not want a big flame that could be seen far away, so I let it fade and used my headlamp only when I moved. I crawled into the tent, zipped the door, and lay back on my sleeping pad. For a while I just listened. My own breathing. My heart slowing from the day's hike. The thin nylon walls moved a little with the breeze. It was all normal until I heard footsteps. They were light at first, like something testing the ground. Not leaves falling, not wind, not small animals rushing through brush the way they normally do in fast little bursts. These were slow, spaced steps. Weight settling, lifting, settling again. I held my breath without meaning to. My mind started counting them. 1, 2, 3. They stopped, and the quiet that followed was worse than the sound. I could picture someone or something standing there in the dark just outside the tent, not moving, just listening the same way I was listening. I told myself it was a deer. Or maybe a stray dog that had wandered in from the road. I did not unzip the tent. I did not move at all. After a long time I heard the steps again, but this time they were farther away and then they faded. I waited another long stretch of time before I let my lungs release the breath I was holding. I tried to sleep after that, but my body refused. Every small rustle became important. Even the sound of my own sleeve brushing against my bag made me jump inside. At some point I must have fallen asleep because I woke to the gray light of early morning. It was the kind of light that makes everything look washed out and cold. The first thought that came into my head was about those footsteps. I waited, listening again, but the forest sounded open and harmless now. Birds had started again. I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was damp and cold against my face. My fire ring was as I had left it. My pack was upright. From a distance nothing looked wrong. Then I saw the ground on the far side of the clearing. The pine needles there had been crushed into a darker shape. I walked closer. There were footprints. Not boots like mine, but sneakers with a smooth sole pattern. They came from the trees, stopped near my tent, turned and walked back out the way they had come. The prints were clear and fresh. I felt my chest tighten when I saw how close they had been to where my head had rested during the night. There were other details that I had missed in the rush of my setup the day before. A plastic wrapper half buried under needles. A broken branch at easy arm height, snapped recently enough that the inside wood was still pale and not yet darkened by air. A small piece of dirty cloth tangled on a thorn. None of these things were mine. They meant someone else had been here not long ago, maybe even still nearby when I arrived. The idea that I had not been alone, even when I thought I was, spread through me like cold water. I decided to leave that morning instead of staying another night as I had planned. I packed up slowly but with that same tightness in my chest. Every sound made me stop and scan the trees. I noticed how many places there were where someone could stand and watch without being seen. The forest no longer felt wide and gentle. It felt crowded with places to hide. On the way back to the road, I took a slightly different path by mistake. The ground sloped down and opened into a wider area where the trees thinned. That was where I saw it. There was an old fire pit with a ring of blackened stones and fresh ash in the middle. Nearby were crushed beer cans, a burnt metal pot, and a torn blue tarp half buried under dirt. There were deep boot prints and lighter shoe prints all around. A tree trunk had knife marks carved into it, rough and angry lines cut again and again in the same spot. A strong sour smell hung in the air like trash and stale smoke. It was clear someone had been living there for at least a few nights, maybe longer. There was also a crude snare made from wire hanging low between two trees, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. It was meant for animals, but seeing it made my stomach turn. I realized then that the footsteps from the night were probably not from some lost hiker. They were from whoever used this place. Maybe they had heard me arrive. Maybe they had followed the light of my small fire. Maybe they were just curious, or maybe they were deciding something about me in the dark while I lay in my thin nylon tent thinking of deer and stray dogs. I did not touch anything. I backed away the same way I had come, careful of where I stepped, careful not to trip on anything, careful not to make noise. My mind kept showing me an image of someone standing just out of sight between the trees, watching me the way people watch animals without saying a word. I kept walking, faster this time, my shoulders tight, my pack shifting with every step. When I finally reached the road, the sound of a distant car engine felt unreal but also like safety. The forest behind me looked normal again from the outside, just green and still and ordinary. If someone had driven by in that moment, they would have seen nothing strange at all. Just trees. Just another person finishing a hike. The truth of what had happened was hidden under shade, under needles, under the careful quiet of people who live where others think no one does. I sat in my car for a long time before starting it. My hands were shaking even though nothing had actually happened to me. I had not been touched. I had not been chased or attacked. But the fear was still heavy because it came from knowing how thin the line was between being fine and not being fine. I thought about how easy it would have been for things to go another way. A tent is only fabric. A zipper is only metal teeth. The forest at night is full of blind spots. The ending of that trip was not dramatic in the way stories sometimes make things. I drove home. I unpacked. I showered and watched the dirt swirl down the drain. My body was safe, but the real ending was in my head. I understood something that I had not fully understood before. The most frightening things do not need to be unreal, and they do not need to glow or whisper or crawl out of stories. They can walk on quiet feet in the dark. They can stand still and wait. They can look at your camp from the trees and leave footprints near your tent while you lie inside trying to call every sound natural. What stayed with me was the knowledge that I had shared that forest with someone I did not see and who did not want to be seen. Someone who had a camp hidden not far from mine, with tools and ash and trash and wire snares. Someone who moved close enough in the night to leave tracks in the soft ground inches from my things. I will camp again, but I will never again pretend that empty places are truly empty just because I am alone in them. The woods did not change. My idea of them did. That is the clear ending to it. I went out for quiet, and instead I found how thin quiet can be, how it can hold other lives, other plans, and other eyes inside it. Nothing supernatural followed me back. No ghost, no monster. Just a real fear tied to real footprints and real signs of people living where maps say nothing is. I left, and I was lucky to leave with nothing more than that lesson. I decided to go camping alone on a long weekend, thinking it would be the perfect way to disconnect from everything. I had a small tent, a backpack with supplies, a sleeping bag, and enough food and water for 2 days. I picked a spot deep in a national forest I'd never explored before. The drive-in was long, the kind that winds through dirt roads and overgrown paths, with the engine rattling under the weight of the car and my nerves. When I finally arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, turning the sky a dull orange. I picked a flat clearing not too far from a creek, surrounded by tall pines. The smell of wet earth and pine sap filled the air, and at first I felt calm, like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. I started by setting up the tent. The ground was uneven and littered with roots, so I had to be careful with the stakes. My hands were shaking slightly, but I brushed it off as excitement. By the time I finished, the sun had gone completely, leaving only the dim twilight and the sounds of the forest waking up for the night. I gathered some dry wood for a fire, careful to keep it small. I didn't want it blazing too bright. I wanted to blend into the forest as much as possible, like a shadow. I lit it carefully, listening to the crackle of flames and feeling the first real chill of the night sink into my bones. As I ate my dinner, a tin of beans warmed over the fire, I noticed that the forest was unusually quiet. No crickets, no rustling of small animals, just the occasional sigh of the wind through the trees. It made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just the calm before the night fully settled. I packed up the food and put it away, making sure everything was sealed. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag, thinking I could just close my eyes and let sleep come quickly. But I couldn't sleep. The darkness felt heavy, pressing in from every side. The forest around me had become a shadowed maze of shapes, each tree trunk like a silent sentinel. Then I heard a faint snapping sound from somewhere beyond the creek. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a branch under an animal's foot. But then it came again, closer this time, a deliberate crack of a branch followed by another. Not random at all. Something was moving, and it wasn't small. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. Still, the snapping continued, moving slowly around my camp. My heartbeat quickened. I tried to stay calm, telling myself to think logically. Bears were known to be in this area. Maybe a deer. But something about the movement didn't feel natural. It was too careful, too aware. I tightened my grip on a small hatchet I kept near me, and I thought about whether I should pack up and leave right then. Minutes passed like hours. The snapping moved closer to the edge of the firelight, and then it stopped. Dead silence returned, heavier than before. I stayed frozen, listening to my own breathing, waiting for anything. Then I saw a dark figure slipping between the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't make out details, but it wasn't an animal. It was upright, moving with a human-like rhythm, slow and measured. My mind raced. Whoever it was had been circling my camp, and I had no way to know if they were armed or what they wanted. I tried to remember everything I'd read about surviving encounters like this. Don't scream, don't run, stay visible if possible. I stayed where I was, pretending the firelight was enough to keep me safe, praying it wouldn't try to get closer. The figure lingered at the tree line for what felt like forever, and then it started moving away, slipping into the darkness as silently as it had appeared. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning, adding wood constantly, every shadow in the forest making my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize what had happened, telling myself it could have been a hunter or a lost hiker. But even as I thought that, I knew the careful movements and the timing suggested it wasn't random. Whatever it was, it had been studying me, maybe even tracking me. At first light, I packed everything up slowly, avoiding sudden movements. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening but still alien. I kept my eyes on every tree, every bush, expecting the figure to reappear. I decided to take the same path I came in, but as I walked, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Footprints in the dirt, larger than mine, not human but humanoid enough to be disturbing. They followed the curve of my path for a while before disappearing into the underbrush. I picked up my pace, keeping my hatchet ready, my senses stretched to the limit. I reached my car, relief washing over me, but I didn't stop until I was out of the forest entirely. On the drive back, the adrenaline started to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the lingering fear of what I had seen. I called the ranger station later that day to report the footprints and the presence of someone or something watching campers. They listened politely but told me it could have been anything from hunters to stray wildlife. I didn't press the point. They wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had felt in the dark. That experience stayed with me for months. I couldn't shake the memory of being watched, the sound of deliberate steps breaking the silence, the shadow that moved just beyond the firelight. But I also realized something important. Fear can be overwhelming, but preparation and awareness can save you. I started carrying better tools, learning more about survival, and always letting someone know exactly where I would be. The forest is unpredictable, and sometimes people or things move in ways that remind you just how small and vulnerable you are. I never went back to that specific spot, and I don't plan to. But I do camp still because the experience taught me a lot about being alert, about trusting instincts, and about respecting the wilderness. I now know that danger doesn't have to be supernatural to be terrifying. It can be as simple as a human, or something like a human watching silently from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And surviving that teaches you a clarity about yourself you can't learn any other way. I remember the day I decided to go camping alone as if it were yesterday. It was late September, and the air had a crisp edge that hinted winter was coming. I had driven for hours along winding mountain roads, leaving the city behind, until I found a narrow trailhead tucked between thick groves of pine. The kind of trail that most people overlook, which was exactly what I wanted: solitude, quiet, and the kind of isolation that makes you feel alive in your own skin. I parked my car, double-checked my pack, and started walking. The sunlight was warm but fading, slanting gold through the trees, and every step I took stirred up the smell of pine needles, wet earth, and something slightly metallic that I couldn't place at first. The trail was narrow, and the further I went, the less human interference I noticed. Broken branches crunched under my boots, and small rocks rolled silently beneath my weight. Birds called in the distance, and occasionally a squirrel would dart across the path, pausing just long enough for me to see it before disappearing again. I kept walking, following the faint trail markings, knowing that I wanted to find a small clearing by a creek that I had spotted on a map a week before. The map didn't show any roads or other campers nearby, just wilderness. That alone was intoxicating, a mix of freedom and unease. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing. It was perfect. A thin creek wound through the rocks, babbling quietly. Sunlight flickered off the water, and I could see the faint shimmer of fish under the surface. I set my pack down and began the familiar process of setting up my tent, laying out my sleeping bag, and arranging firewood I gathered from fallen branches. Everything felt normal, the way it always did when I camped. Birds overhead, wind in the trees, water flowing just close enough to hear over the crackle of my fire. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, the forest around me started to change. Shadows lengthened, moving like fingers across the ground. I built a small fire, careful to keep it contained, and watched the sky turn a deep orange that slowly faded to purple. That's when I started noticing the small, unsettling sounds. A rustle here, a twig snapping there, nothing that made sense at first. I chalked it up to the forest being alive, to the wind, to small animals. But then it started to feel deliberate. Something was moving around my clearing just out of sight. The noises weren't random. They circled, paused, and moved again, as if measuring me, waiting. I thought of bears or coyotes. I knew the area wasn't known for aggressive predators, but even a curious animal can be dangerous at night. I stared into the darkness past the fire, straining to see movement, but all I saw were trees swaying. My heart started to beat a little faster. I double-checked that my food was secured in my pack, tied it to a branch as high as I could reach, and grabbed a stout stick for protection. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the forest settling, but the noises kept coming. Night fell fully, and I was alone in the dark. The fire was my only source of comfort, but I kept it small, worried that a large blaze would attract attention, whatever kind it was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something moving between the trees, a shadow that didn't match the wind or the brush. I tried to stay calm, to breathe slowly, but the isolation had a tightening effect on me, like the air itself was pressing down. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the thought of navigating the trail in complete darkness seemed worse. Around midnight, I heard it. A deep, low growl, faint at first and then closer, as if something was following the creek. I froze. The hair on my arms stood up. I didn't move. I couldn't. The sound was too close to ignore. Then I heard footsteps, or maybe something heavier than footsteps, breaking branches carefully but deliberately. The firelight flickered over the ground, casting shadows that moved in ways I couldn't predict. I gripped my stick, realizing that I hadn't felt fear like this in years. Not fear of animals, not fear of accidents. Fear of the unknown, and fear of the fact that I was alone with it. I decided to move quietly to my car. If whatever it was wanted to leave me alone, distance and human presence might help. I slowly started breaking down my tent, piece by piece, trying not to make any noise. My hands were shaking, and every snap of a branch felt magnified in the darkness. I thought I saw movement behind a tree, a silhouette larger than any deer. My mind raced with possibilities. A bear, a large wildcat, or maybe even another human, which terrified me more. By the time I had my pack on my back and the tent folded, the noises had stopped. Silence settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. I considered waiting, but the thought of staying in the clearing another hour was unbearable. I started walking along the trail, careful to step lightly, sticking close to the creek for guidance. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, just enough to show the rocks and roots. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a potential threat. About an hour into the walk back, I stumbled over a large root and fell hard. Pain shot through my ankle. I gritted my teeth, knowing that limping would slow me down and make me more vulnerable. I rested for a moment, listening carefully. Nothing. No footsteps, no growls, just the creek and the night sounds. I forced myself to keep moving, leaning on my stick like a crutch. The pain in my ankle was sharp, but fear kept me moving faster than I probably should have. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I saw the faint glimmer of my car lights through the trees. Relief hit me like a wave. I limped the last few meters and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. The isolation, the fear, the adrenaline, it all started to crash on me at once. My body trembled and I realized how exhausted I was. I kept the engine running and the headlights on, sitting there for nearly an hour, too afraid to go back inside, just staring into the trees until the first hints of dawn lightened the sky. By sunrise, I felt safe enough to drive back down the mountain. My ankle ached, but I had escaped. I never saw what had followed me that night, and I don't know if I ever will. But the memory stayed with me, the way the forest seemed alive with something intelligent, something that watched me with patience. The relief I felt when I returned to the road, to other humans, to the certainty of civilization was overwhelming. After that night, I stopped camping alone. I realized that some parts of nature aren't terrifying because of legends or monsters, but because they remind you how small and alone you are. And sometimes being alone is all it takes for the wild to remind you it's bigger, older, and far more patient than you are. Even now, years later, I can still feel that night pressing in on me if I close my eyes. The forest taught me a lesson. Respect the wilderness, but never underestimate the quiet threats that can exist within it. And when the sun goes down, even the familiar can turn dangerous in ways you'll never fully understand. I had always liked camping alone. There was something about being out in the woods, away from the constant buzz of life, that made me feel alive. I packed my gear carefully that morning. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, food for 3 days, water, a first aid kit, and a heavy flashlight. I drove for nearly 2 hours, leaving the paved roads behind, until I found a small clearing by a river I'd spotted on the map. The trees around it were thick and old, their trunks wide and knotted, and the air smelled damp and earthy. Perfect. I set up my tent with some difficulty. The ground was uneven, roots pushing through the thin layer of soil, but eventually it stood firm. I started a small fire, careful to keep it contained, and cooked a simple meal of beans and rice. By the time the sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt satisfied. The first night alone in the woods had always been the hardest, but also the most exhilarating. I lay back in my sleeping bag and listened. The river gurgling softly nearby, the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional call of a distant bird settling in for the night. Everything was calm. As night fell completely, I realized how dark it really was. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet around the tent, and the forest seemed to press in on every side. I had gone through this before. I knew it was normal, but my mind played tricks. Every snap of a twig sounded like someone stepping closer. Every rustle of leaves felt like it had direction, like something was moving just beyond the edge of the light. I shook my head to clear it. It was just the wind. Animals, maybe. Nothing more. I tried to sleep, but that first night in unfamiliar woods is always filled with little noises that seem louder than they are. A deer crashing through brush, the river slapping against rocks, my own breathing. At one point, I thought I heard something that wasn't natural, a low thud followed by another, like footsteps. My heart rate jumped. I unzipped the tent carefully and peered outside, but the beam of my flashlight only caught trees, undergrowth, and the river glimmering faintly under the moonlight. I couldn't see anyone, but I kept my flashlight close. Every few minutes I would hear the sound again. Thud, thud. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. Not an animal. Not something small. I stayed frozen for a long while, listening. Then I realized it was coming from the other side of the clearing. My mind started racing. Someone could be out there watching, maybe even waiting. I reminded myself I wasn't near a trail. Who would be here? I had no cell service, no way to call for help. The rational part of me said it was probably a large animal, maybe a bear stepping on thick branches. But the thuds were too regular. Something about them felt human. I decided I needed to stay calm and act smart. I grabbed my small folding knife from my pocket and unzipped the tent just enough to see. The thuds stopped. I held my breath. Then slowly I saw movement between the trees. A figure hunched, moving slowly toward the river. My stomach dropped. I didn't run. I knew that running might draw attention. Instead, I waited, watching. The figure paused, seemed to look in my direction, then moved away again, disappearing into the darkness. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, flashlight resting on my chest, listening to every sound. Every small noise was amplified in the dark. The river became a shield and a hazard at the same time. It was close enough to mask footsteps, but also dangerous if I needed to move quickly. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly, until the first hint of dawn tinged the sky with gray. I was exhausted, trembling, but I hadn't heard anything for a while. The next morning, I decided to break camp. I packed my tent quickly, ate a cold breakfast, and carried my pack down to the river. As I was gathering my things, I noticed something odd. Fresh footprints in the mud leading from the trees to the river. They were large, booted prints, not deer or bear tracks. They stopped at the riverbank, but there were scuff marks that suggested someone had leaned over, maybe to drink or wash their hands. My heart sank. Whoever had been here last night had come close enough to see me if they had wanted. I didn't panic, but I did get careful. I decided to move along the river, keeping my pack low and my eyes scanning constantly. Every shadow felt like it might hide something, every rustle in the brush made me tense. Hours passed as I hiked along the riverbank. I stayed silent, listening. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By midday, I came across a small logging trail. It was faint, overgrown, but clear enough that I could follow it. Relief washed over me. I wasn't trapped in the dense forest anymore. I kept moving, listening, scanning, but the trail led me gradually out of the thick woods. By late afternoon, I reached a paved road. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in almost 24 hours. A car passed by slowly, its driver giving me a wary look, but I waved and kept walking until I found a gas station. I used the phone there to call a friend, someone I trusted, and told them where I was. That night, I stayed at a motel, still shaken but safe. I kept thinking about the footprints, about the sound of those deliberate thuds in the night. I realized later that whoever had been in the woods might have just been another camper, maybe even someone lost or desperate, but the uncertainty, the not knowing, was what made it so terrifying. The lesson stayed with me. The woods are beautiful, but they are unpredictable. Isolation comes with risk. I had prepared for the weather, for injury, for wildlife, but not for another human presence. That experience changed the way I camped. I never went entirely alone again. I started telling friends exactly where I would be, leaving detailed plans behind. I carried a whistle, extra food, more means of defense, and I learned to read the signs around me carefully. I still love camping. I still love that feeling of being completely immersed in the forest. But I also carry a constant awareness now, a respect for the fact that not all threats are visible, not all dangers are predictable. The woods are quiet and calm most of the time, but a single silent human presence can turn an adventure into a nightmare. Eventually, I returned to that same forest months later with a friend. This time we hiked together, kept our tents near the trail, and I could enjoy the river without the gnawing fear at the back of my mind. The sun reflected on the water, birds sang, and I realized I could still love the forest even after being scared. But I would never forget that first night alone, the sound of thuds in the darkness and the footprints by the river. They were a reminder that the woods are alive in ways you can't always see. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to escape the city, the noise, the endless pressure, and just breathe. The forest I chose was far off the beaten path, a place I'd only read about online. The map showed a small clearing near a stream, far from any roads or other people. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, and some basic survival gear. I told myself I was experienced enough to handle it alone, though part of me still felt a nervous flutter when I drove deeper into the woods. The drive had been long, the road turning from paved to gravel, then to a rough, narrow dirt path that shook the car with every bump. Eventually, I had to park and hike the last mile into the forest. My backpack felt heavier than I expected, each step crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The sunlight was fading, and by the time I reached the clearing, the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure against the uneven ground. The stream gurgled nearby, a soothing sound at first, until I noticed how quiet the forest was beyond that. No birds, no insects buzzing, nothing except the rustle of leaves. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just evening settling in. As night fell, I built a small fire, the flames crackling and sending sparks into the dark. I boiled some water for dinner, eating in silence while the darkness pressed closer around me. After a while, I lay in my sleeping bag inside the tent, listening to the occasional snap of a branch outside. At first, I assumed it was a deer or a small animal, but as the hours passed, the sounds became more deliberate. Footsteps, light and careful, circling the tent. My heart started racing. I froze, listening. The noises stopped whenever I tried to pinpoint them, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was awake. My mind raced with possibilities. I'd read about hikers getting lost or stalked, and suddenly my own solitude felt dangerous. The first panic passed when I reminded myself I was in a remote area. The nearest person would be miles away. But the sounds didn't stop. Occasionally, there was a scraping sound, like something dragging across rocks or roots. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it could be an animal. Maybe a bear or a coyote, though nothing about the movements sounded natural. They were too methodical. I had a small knife at my side and I kept a flashlight in my hand, but the thought of leaving the safety of my tent filled me with dread. Hours passed this way and the fire dwindled. Eventually, exhaustion overpowered fear and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. I woke to the sound of my backpack zipper being pulled. My eyes snapped open, heart in my throat. The tent flap had been nudged open slightly, though I was sure I'd zipped it completely before sleeping. Whoever or whatever was out there had been inside the perimeter of my camp. Adrenaline surged. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it outside. Nothing. No movement, no shadows, just the trees swaying in the night breeze. I didn't sleep much after that. The rest of the night was filled with subtle sounds. The distant cracking of branches, leaves rustling too deliberately to be random. Every time I moved or made a sound, the forest seemed to respond. By morning, I was jittery, exhausted, and tense, constantly scanning the trees and listening for any anomaly. The sunrise brought some relief. Light broke through the canopy, painting golden streaks across the forest floor. I forced myself to eat breakfast, a simple granola bar and some water, trying to act normal, though my hands trembled slightly. I debated packing up and leaving immediately, but part of me wanted to investigate, to see what had been haunting my night. I knew it was dangerous, but curiosity edged over fear. I followed the faint trail that led to the stream, thinking maybe something had left tracks overnight. The ground was soft from early morning dew and soon I saw them footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were too large and the shape was unmistakably human. They circled my tent, passed near the water, and disappeared into the denser part of the forest. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here, had been watching me, and had possibly been inside my camp while I slept. I didn't panic yet. I considered calling for help, but there was no signal. My phone was dead. I had to get back to the car and leave fast. I packed quickly, leaving behind anything that might attract attention, and slung my backpack over my shoulder. As I walked back the way I came, I noticed more signs. Broken branches at head height, disturbed underbrush. Someone had followed the same path I used to enter the clearing. The hike back was tense and silent. Every snap of a twig made me spin around. I reminded myself to stay calm, to think logically. I wasn't completely alone. The road wasn't far and the car meant I had a way out. The forest seemed endless, though, and the thought that someone could emerge from the trees at any moment made my pulse hammer. Finally, I reached the car. Relief flooded me, but I didn't stop to relax. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The gravel crunched under the tires as I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror constantly, convinced I could see a figure among the trees. After a few miles, the forest thinned and the road widened. No one followed. Once I reached the first gas station outside the woods, I pulled over and exhaled, shaking. My hands were still trembling. I called the local authorities and reported the footprints and the intrusion, though I knew there was little they could do in such a remote area. They told me they would send a ranger to check the site, but by the time I returned home, the memory of the forest, the footprints, and the sounds had already left a mark I couldn't shake. That night, back in my apartment with doors locked and lights on, I realized something important. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was patient. Whoever had been there didn't need to scare me with loud noises or attacks. They just needed to exist in the same space, moving carefully, leaving me unsure of what was real. It was a different kind of fear, one that didn't end with sunrise, it stayed in your mind. I never went back to that part of the forest. I avoided remote camping alone after that, always making sure I had company or cell service. I kept my gear ready and my instincts sharp. The memory stayed vivid, especially the footprints, the way they circled my camp and disappeared. It reminded me that the wilderness is not just nature, it's unpredictable, and sometimes the scariest thing out there is not an animal, not a ghost, but another human who doesn't need to be seen to be dangerous. I learned something else too. I learned to respect the limits of solitude. I learned that preparation isn't just about supplies and maps, but about understanding the risks of isolation. And most importantly, I learned that survival isn't about bravery, it's about awareness, caution, and knowing when to leave. The fear I felt in that forest changed me, but in a way that made me smarter, more cautious, and more grateful for safety. That fear stayed with me, but it also kept me alive. I remember the exact moment I realized camping alone in the wilderness wasn't going to be the peaceful escape I had imagined. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest, far off any marked trails, where the map showed only thick trees and a small creek winding through the area. The idea had sounded perfect. Total isolation, the quiet of nature, and a chance to sleep under the stars without the hum of city life or the chatter of other campers. But by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, that serenity began to twist into something far more unsettling. I arrived in the late afternoon, my backpack heavy with supplies, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a small first aid kit. The trail had been narrow and overgrown, and by the time I found a suitable clearing near the creek, the sky was already tinged orange and pink. I dropped my pack, brushed off my pants, and began setting up my tent. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks and tangled roots, which made hammering in the stakes a slow, frustrating process. But eventually, the tent stood firm, its nylon walls rustling slightly in the early evening breeze. I wandered a little along the creek, skipping stones and watching the water slip over rocks. The sound was soothing at first, a gentle rushing that seemed to wash away the tension of my city life. Birds flitted overhead, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't completely alone. But as the light faded, the forest took on a different character. Shadows stretched long across the ground, merging with the dark shapes of trees. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me start, my heartbeat quickening despite my attempts to stay calm. I decided to start a fire before it got too dark. Gathering dry branches and kindling, I struck my lighter against a rock several times before a small flame caught. I nurtured it carefully, blowing gently until the fire grew into a modest blaze. The warm glow of the flames brought a sense of relief, a tiny island of light in the encroaching darkness. I roasted a couple of sausages I had packed, savoring the taste and trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling along the back of my neck. Night fell fully and the forest became a wall of black. I had brought a flashlight, but I avoided turning it on, thinking it might ruin the experience of being alone in the dark. That's when I first noticed the smell of faint, acrid odor carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just smoke from the fire or maybe some damp, decaying leaves. But as I moved closer to the creek to refill my water bottle, the smell grew stronger, like something had died nearby. My stomach churned slightly and I quickened my pace back to the tent, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had started to coil inside me. I crawled into my sleeping bag, telling myself I was imagining things. But the forest at night has a way of magnifying every sound. Branches snapped under the weight of unseen animals, leaves rustled, and somewhere far enough away that I couldn't see, a heavier thud echoed through the trees. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the patter of a small animal. It was deliberate, almost like footsteps on the uneven forest floor. I gripped my flashlight, my hands shaking, and flicked it on, casting a beam into the darkness. The light caught a movement at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out what it was, only a dark, shifting shape among the trees. My first instinct was to tell myself it was a deer, a bear, maybe even a stray dog. But the sound of the footsteps didn't match that of an animal. It was heavier, and the rhythm suggested something or someone walking cautiously but deliberately. I stayed frozen in the tent for what felt like hours, listening as the sounds moved closer, circling the clearing. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. I had brought a small knife, but that was no protection against whatever was out there. My fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a weak glow that barely reached the tree line. Every rustle seemed louder than the last. I considered leaving immediately, but without a clear path back to the trailhead, I knew I could get lost in the pitch-black forest. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. Absolute silence returned, and I could hear only the creak, which now sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet. My body refused to relax, though. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time was hard to measure in the dark, but I stayed in the sleeping bag, clutching my knife and flashlight, too scared to even breathe deeply. At some point, exhaustion overtook me and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke suddenly to the sound of my tent flap rustling. I froze, straining my eyes through the dark. A shadow moved outside, large and deliberate. Heart hammering, I grabbed my flashlight and yanked the flap open. There was nothing there. Only the forest, quiet except for the creek. I stared into the trees, trying to convince myself that fear had made me see things. The night passed in a tense blur. Every sound, branch snapping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls made me jump. I didn't sleep properly, only dozing in brief, alert bursts. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt like I hadn't slept in days. I packed my tent quickly, trying not to look around too much. The forest seemed calmer now, almost normal in the pale morning light, but the memory of the night lingered like a shadow over my mind. I stuck to the creek, using it as a guide to get back to the trail. The forest was no longer menacing in the daylight, but I kept moving fast, my senses on high alert. By mid-morning, I finally stumbled onto a faint path I had overlooked the day before. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked where the dirt road met the forest edge. I locked the doors, sat inside, and let myself breathe for the first time in hours. Looking back as I drove away, I realized how close I had come to real danger, not from ghosts or myths, but from the sheer unpredictability of the wilderness. Alone in the dark, every sound is amplified, every shadow a threat. The forest doesn't care about your fears, but it does punish those who underestimate it. I had learned something important. Preparation and caution are vital, but even then, isolation carries a weight that can make the bravest person question reality. By the time I got home, I felt both relieved and shaken. I unpacked slowly, checking every item as if I expected some trace of the forest to follow me. I took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away not just the dirt and sweat, but the lingering tension from the night. Sitting afterward with a cup of tea, I felt an odd mixture of triumph and humility. I had survived alone in the wilderness, but it had left its mark on me. From that experience, I realized that camping alone isn't about bravery, it's about respect. Respect for nature, for its power, and for the unknown elements that can turn a peaceful night into a test of endurance. I never went back to that exact spot, and I never ventured that deep into the forest alone again. I still camp, but always with extra precautions, always aware that the forest is indifferent to our presence, and always remembering the fear, the tension, and the lessons learned on that long, dark night. It was a clear ending in the sense that I returned safely, but the experience reshaped the way I approach solitude in the wild. I walked away not just with memories, but with a renewed sense of caution and a deep respect for the unpredictable living world that surrounds us, quiet, beautiful, and occasionally terrifying. I remember the first time I decided to camp alone deep in the forest. I had planned everything meticulously: tent, food, water, flashlight, map, and a small first aid kit. I even double-checked the weather forecast. Clear skies, no rain. It all seemed perfect. I wanted to be completely isolated, to hear nothing but the sounds of nature, to feel truly alone. I never thought I'd feel fear like that from something so ordinary and real. I hiked for hours, following a trail that wound through thick trees. The forest was dense. Sunlight barely reached the ground. Birds chirped occasionally, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near a small creek. It was ideal: a flat spot, soft ground, and a view of the water. I set up my tent, hammered in the stakes, and arranged my supplies neatly. I even built a small fire pit using stones I found nearby. As I worked, I noticed something strange. The forest felt too quiet. Not silent exactly, but almost like it was holding its breath. The usual rustle of leaves from small animals was absent. I shrugged it off. I told myself I was imagining things because I was alone. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I might see someone or something watching me. Once the tent was up and the fire was ready, I gathered some sticks to start the fire. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. When I struck the match, the fire caught immediately, crackling and spitting sparks. I sat back, feeling satisfied. I ate a small dinner of canned beans and bread, washing it down with water from my bottle. The forest around me grew darker as the sun disappeared. Night came quickly. Stars appeared through the gaps in the trees, and the moonlight reflected off the creek. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the occasional sound of water and the wind moving through the branches. But then I heard a faint rustling, soft at first, coming from the tree line beyond the clearing. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was probably just a deer or some small animal. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then I heard a branch snap. I froze, holding my breath. Something was moving through the underbrush, something big. I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing, just shadows of trees and the glint of leaves. My mind raced. It had to be an animal, right? Maybe a bear? I remembered the bear spray in my pack, and I slowly reached for it. Suddenly, I heard the creek splash, like someone or something had stepped into the water. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed a long stick near the fire and held it like a weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't do much against a wild animal. The rustling moved closer, circling the clearing. My eyes darted around, trying to catch a glimpse. I realized then that the sounds weren't random, they were deliberate, calculated. Whoever or whatever was out there, it was watching me. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that panicking would make things worse. I turned on my flashlight again, scanning the perimeter, but still saw nothing. Then I heard it breathing. Low, heavy breathing coming from just beyond the tree line. I froze. I knew I wasn't hearing things. That wasn't an animal. I couldn't make out what it was, but the sound was deliberate and it was close. My survival instincts kicked in. I decided to stay in the tent and make as little noise as possible. I crawled into the tent, pulling the flap closed as quietly as I could. My flashlight rested beside me, barely illuminating the fabric walls. Every little noise outside made me flinch. I kept telling myself it had to be a human. No animal could move that carefully and make that sound. I regretted not hiking with someone, regretted ever thinking I could handle being completely alone. Time stretched endlessly. I stayed still, listening. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, every distant call of a night bird sounded amplified. Hours passed, though I have no way of knowing exactly how many. My legs cramped, my hands were numb from holding the flashlight. At one point I thought I saw a shadow pass by the tent. My mind screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to give away my position. Eventually the sound stopped. The forest returned to its strange, suffocating quiet. I stayed in the tent until dawn, too scared to move. When the first light came, I slowly unzipped the flap and peeked outside. The clearing was empty. My fire had burned down to ash. The ground around the tent was undisturbed, except for one set of footprints leading from the tree line to the edge of the creek, then disappearing into the forest. They were too big to be mine, and their depth told me they belonged to someone heavy. I packed my tent quickly, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the stakes twice. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't want to wait another second. I hiked out of that forest as fast as I could without running, following the trail back to the car. Every crack of a branch underfoot made me jump. Every shadow made me spin around. I didn't look back until I reached the clearing where I had started my hike. When I finally got back to my car, I sat in the driver's seat, breathing heavily. The forest loomed behind me, silent and indifferent. I realized how lucky I was. Whoever or whatever had been watching me didn't follow. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away, the first human I'd seen in nearly 24 hours. After that night, I never went camping alone again. I never underestimated the forest. Never thought I could handle isolation without knowing exactly what I might face. I still go back to the same area sometimes, but always with someone else, always prepared. And I carry a knife and bear spray even if I don't plan to use it. That night taught me one simple truth. Fear doesn't come from ghosts or monsters. Fear comes from knowing that out there, in the dark, someone else could be watching you and you have no way of knowing if they're friendly or not. The memory stays with me, a constant reminder whenever I hear the wind in the trees or footsteps behind me in the dark. Real danger doesn't announce itself with howls or glowing eyes. Real danger is quiet, patient, and waiting. And once you've felt it, you never forget it. By the end of that experience, I understood why survival isn't about strength, it's about caution, awareness, and respect for forces you can't control. I came out alive and I made it home, and that alone was enough. I didn't need a dramatic ending or some heroic moment. The ending was simply survival and knowing that I was still here to tell the story. I had gone camping before, but always with other people. This time I wanted to prove something to myself. I wanted silence that I could not switch off, darkness that did not come from a light switch, and space where there were no walls. So I chose a quiet forest area near a lake that I had seen on maps. It looked calm and far away from towns. The road there turned into dirt and then into nothing, and I had to walk the last part with my backpack pulling hard on my shoulders. When I reached the clearing near the lake, the light on the water looked soft and harmless. I could smell wet soil and pine. The air felt heavier than city air, but in a good way at first, like it filled my chest better. I picked a flat piece of ground near some trees and set up my small tent. The nylon crackled under my hands. The pegs were stubborn in the hard earth. My hands got dirty in minutes, and I kept wiping them on my pants, which did nothing. My back hurt and sweat ran down my neck, but it felt honest. It felt like real work that had a clear result. The first hours were calm. I boiled water on my small stove. The flame hissed. I looked at the lake and watched insects skimming the surface. Small fish jumped sometimes and left round rings in the water that spread and vanished. The forest made a low, steady sound, leaves rubbing together, needles shifting, branches ticking. There was no sudden silence like in movies, just a constant background that I stopped noticing until it changed again. As evening came, the light faded in layers. Colors went from green to gray to shapes only. I ate my food slowly, feeling every bite because there was nothing else to do at the same time. I wanted to feel brave. I told myself in my head that this was normal nature, that many people camp alone, that fear would only come from my own thoughts. I tried to believe that. The first uneasy feeling came when I noticed small things that did not match how I had left them. A stick I used to prop open the tent flap was a little farther from where I remembered. My backpack strap lay at a different angle. I kept telling myself I was tired and had a bad memory, that I was looking for patterns that were not there. But my chest still felt tight. My body felt something before my thoughts could name it. Night did not fall like a curtain. It crept. I watched the last light leave the tops of the trees and then the middle and then the ground. I turned on my headlamp and the beam cut a small tunnel into the dark. Everything outside the white circle was thick black. The forest sound changed again. Less bird noise. More small scratching, quick steps in dry leaves, wind pushing branches until they groaned. I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed. The zipper sound was loud and thin. Inside the tent it smelled like plastic and my own sweat. The floor was uneven under my sleeping mat. I lay down and tried to listen for nothing, but instead I heard everything. Water moving in the lake. Trees shifting. Insects hitting the tent wall and sliding down. My heart beating too hard in my ears. At some point I slept, but it was not deep sleep. It was the kind that feels like floating just above waking up. I kept drifting in and out, not sure how much time was passing. Then I opened my eyes because I knew something had changed. I did not know what it was at first. The air had gone still. Even the soft lake sound felt distant. I lay frozen, listening. Then I heard slow, careful steps outside my tent. They did not sound like an animal jumping or running. They sounded like weight being set down with control. Dry leaves crushing. Pause. Another step. The steps moved around my tent, not straight but circling, stopping sometimes like whoever or whatever it was looking at me through the thin fabric. I could see nothing, only the shadow of branches shifting when my tent moved in the faint breeze. I held my breath and tried not to move the sleeping bag because even a small sound felt huge. I thought about every story I had read online about people meeting strangers in the woods, about people who lived hidden there, about hunters, criminals, or simply someone who did not want me here. My brain threw every image at me at once. My body reacted like it already knew I was in danger. My hands were wet and my mouth went dry. The steps stopped very close to my head. The nylon wall of the tent bent inward a little, like something was inches from it. I felt the shape of being watched even though I could not see eyes. There was no voice, no breathing I could clearly hear, only stillness and weight. I stayed as still as I could for what felt like forever, counting my breaths, waiting for the zipper sound, waiting for a hand, waiting for anything. Then the steps moved away again, slow at first and then fading into the general noise of the forest. I did not sleep again. I lay there until a faint gray color returned to the tent fabric, a sign of morning. It was the longest night I have ever lived through, stretched thin and sharp. Every small sound felt like it had teeth. When I finally unzipped the tent in the early light, the air outside felt colder. My body felt shaky and weak, like I had run for hours even though I had barely moved. The ground around my tent told the story that my ears had already heard. There were footprints in the thin layer of dry pine needles and soft dirt. Not boot prints with clear tread, but the broad shape of shoes. Human. They circled my tent, stopping on the side where my head had been. There were broken twigs near my backpack, and the bag itself was shifted several inches from where I had placed it. Nothing was stolen, at least nothing obvious. The food was still there. The stove was there. But zippers on the backpack were open that I remembered closing. The inside pockets looked touched, not dumped out, just explored. That detail made the fear worse. It meant someone was not in a rush. Someone had enough time and enough confidence to stand there and look through my things while I slept a few feet away. The lake that had looked calm the day before now felt wide and exposing. My tent looked thin and stupid. The forest that had felt alive now felt like something that could swallow sound and keep secrets forever. I started packing with clumsy hands. Every noise I made sounded like it could be heard for miles. I kept looking up, expecting to see someone standing between the trees, but there was nothing there, only shadows and trunks. At one point while rolling up my sleeping bag, I saw something else that made my stomach twist. On a low branch near my camp, there were small fresh cuts, neat slices in the bark, like someone had dragged a knife there without much force. They were not deep, but they were new. Sap was just starting to shine in the wounds. There was no reason for them to be there. They felt like marks of boredom or patience, like something someone does while waiting. I thought about staying to prove that I was not afraid, but my body disagreed. My body wanted out. Fear had become something physical, a weight between my ribs that pushed me forward. I packed the last things in a rush, barely caring how they fit. I doused the fire pit I had barely used, even though it felt pointless, like a tiny polite act in a place where politeness did not matter. The walk back to the car felt much longer than the walk in. Every snapping twig behind me made me turn. The trail that had looked friendly now felt like a tunnel with eyes on both sides. My backpack seemed louder. My breath sounded like it did not belong to the forest and would draw attention. The trees all looked the same, and for a few minutes I worried I had lost the path even though it was right under my feet. When I finally reached the car, it looked small and thin, but it had doors that locked and glass I could see through. I threw my pack in without care, got inside and locked the doors so fast my hands shook. Only then did I notice how tense my shoulders had been. They ached when I let them fall. I sat there for a full minute before starting the engine, just listening and watching the tree line, half expecting someone to step out. No one did. On the drive back, the world looked normal again. Gas stations, road signs, other cars. It was strange to realize that the place where I had been terrified was only a short distance from all of this. Nothing dramatic had happened in the obvious sense. No attack. No chase. No obvious proof beyond footprints and small changes in my things. But the fear was real because it had come from something real. Another person out there in the dark, moving slowly around my tent, touching my things, standing close enough to reach through the thin wall if they had wanted. The ending is simple and clear. I did not go back to that lake. I told myself afterward that I had been lucky, not weak. I had listened to the feeling in my body that something was wrong. I learned that fear in the woods is not always made of wild animals or ghosts or stories. Sometimes it is the quiet knowledge that someone else is there, someone you did not expect and cannot see, someone who does not need to say a single word to change how the night feels. Now when I think about camping, I do not picture sunsets first. I picture footprints around my tent in the morning light and zippers moved by hands I did not see. I still like nature. I still like silence, but I respect the fact that the scariest things can be real and simple. A stranger in the dark, a thin wall of fabric, a long night where you understand that your comfort is not guaranteed just because you planned a trip and packed well. I left that forest with everything I brought, but also with something added. A clear line in my mind between peace and danger. It is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet and steady, like the sound of leaves at night. And I know now that if that feeling comes back again, I will listen to it the first time. I had always loved camping. There was something about being deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city, where the only sounds were birds, wind in the trees, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel. That Saturday, I had decided to take a solo trip to a remote area I'd found on a map, a section of forest that wasn't popular or marked heavily on any trail guides. It promised quiet, isolation, and a chance to test my own self-reliance. I packed my backpack carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, extra layers of clothing, a portable stove, some canned food, water, a headlamp, a knife, and my compass. I felt ready for anything. The first part of the hike was easy. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and the forest seemed welcoming. Birds chirped, leaves crunched pleasantly under my boots, and I felt the familiar surge of freedom that comes from leaving human civilization behind. I walked for hours, following a small dirt path that gradually narrowed until it almost disappeared into a denser section of trees. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, I came across a small clearing near a creek. The spot was perfect. A gentle slope led down to the water, and there were enough flat rocks and patches of dry ground to pitch a tent. I set up my camp slowly, enjoying the rhythm of work. Driving stakes, spreading the tent, organizing my gear. Once the tent was ready, I collected some firewood, breaking small branches and logs from dead trees. The smell of the pine and damp earth filled the air. I was careful, keeping the fire small at first, knowing that in a forest, even a tiny spark could become a disaster. By the time the sun started to dip, I had a small campfire crackling, casting shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. At first, everything felt peaceful. The creek babbled softly nearby, birds flew home to their nests, and the evening air smelled faintly of pine resin. I cooked a simple meal on my stove, then sat close to the fire, sipping water and staring at the shifting flames. I felt a profound calm, the kind that comes from being utterly alone in nature. But as darkness settled in, a strange tension crept over the campsite. I noticed it first as a feeling, a sense that I was being watched. The forest seemed quieter than it should have been. Not silent, there were still sounds of water and leaves, but the usual chorus of nocturnal wildlife was absent. No frogs, no distant owl calls, nothing except the occasional snap of a twig. My skin prickled and I glanced around nervously. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the animals had already settled for the night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Still, I kept my fire burning higher and rearranged the logs to make sure I could see out into the clearing. Then I heard it. A low, dragging sound from the direction of the trees behind my camp. At first, I froze, straining my ears. It sounded like something heavy brushing against fallen branches, moving slowly. My heart rate jumped and I instinctively grabbed my knife, holding it close to my chest. I reminded myself I was alone. I had seen signs of deer in the area, maybe even a bear, but a bear moving this quietly? Bears make noise when they walk. And this was deliberate. I realized the sound was coming closer, moving around the perimeter of my small clearing. I could hear it stop and shift weight, then move again. My firelight was too small to illuminate the edges of the forest, and the darkness felt like it was closing in. I wanted to stay calm. I told myself that panicking would only make things worse. I sat on my heels and stayed low, keeping my eyes on the tree-line. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. The dragging sound grew louder for a moment, then stopped. I strained to see movement, but nothing appeared. Then as I blinked, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, low to the ground. I wasn't sure if it was real or a trick of the firelight, but my instincts screamed at me to be ready. I considered leaving the camp and hiking back down to the road, but that would mean stepping into complete darkness, away from my fire. My only light would be my headlamp, which might attract attention if something or someone was watching. I decided to stay put, quiet, alert, and keep the fire between me and the forest. Hours passed like this. Every rustle, every break of a twig made my stomach tighten. I tried to ration my fear, reminding myself to breathe slowly to keep control. I could feel the sweat on my palms as I clutched the knife, my legs drawn up to my chest. The fire had shrunk to glowing embers by now, but I carefully fed it pieces of wood to keep a steady flame. Then just before midnight I heard something unmistakable: footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, pacing around the edge of my clearing. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound of someone or something moving so close, silently, was terrifying. I realized then that the forest wasn't empty. There was someone else here. Someone who had been circling my camp, watching. I didn't know if they were armed or what their intentions were, but I understood that being alone put me in a very dangerous position. My mind raced. I had a knife, some supplies, and a small campfire. I had to make a plan. I did the only thing I could think of. I slowly extinguished my fire, covering the embers with dirt. I packed up my tent quietly, moving as silently as possible, leaving all my food and gear behind. The darkness was complete now, but I kept my head low, listening. The footsteps had stopped when I began moving. I held the knife ready, gripping it like a lifeline. I followed the creek downhill, hoping it would lead me toward the main trail. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I moved carefully over rocks and roots, avoiding noisy patches of dry leaves. The sense of being followed never left me, and I could hear occasional noises, branches snapping, faint shuffling, but no one ever emerged from the shadows. I kept moving, telling myself to stay calm, to keep my body tense and alert. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint glow ahead. It was the reflection of streetlights through the trees, the main road. Relief flooded me, and I picked up my pace, stumbling sometimes over roots and rocks but refusing to fall. I finally broke out of the forest and onto the gravel shoulder of the road, exhausted, trembling, and covered in scratches from bushes. My heart was still racing, but I knew I was safe. I flagged down a passing car and explained as best I could, the driver nodding and calling the police after I gave directions. Later, after police investigation, I learned that there had been reports of illegal squatters living in that forest area. They had been watching hikers for weeks, sometimes stealing supplies or threatening people who stumbled upon their territory. The dragging sounds, the pacing, it had all been real, all intentional. I was lucky. My instincts, my caution, and my decision to move quietly had kept me alive. I never returned to that forest, but the experience stayed with me. I still love camping, still seek quiet in nature, but I learned that the wilderness isn't just beautiful, it can be dangerous in ways that aren't immediately obvious. That night, I learned the difference between the natural sounds of the forest and something darker, something human and deliberate. And I knew I would never ignore the feeling of being watched again.